Hey everyone, it's Jules. Before we jump into the episode, I just wanted to share with you one of the ways you can get in touch with me. Podcasts at diveintobookdesign.com. Send me your questions, your comments, your thoughts on my shows, or any ideas you might have for guests or anything else you want to share. I hope you take advantage of it and let me know what you're thinking. Remember, podcasts at diveintobookdesign.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Dive Into Book Design. I'm Jules Corsair, and today we're going to be talking about the third of the four elements that I feel are the most important when it comes to book design. Just to refresh, the four elements, in no particular order, are trim size, margins, typeface, then font size, and leading. If your software doesn't allow you to customize all four elements, I strongly recommend finding a software that does. In the first episode, we talked about trim size. In the second episode, we talked about margins. So in this episode, we're going to talk about typefaces. So really quickly, before we jump into the meat of the matter, the typeface you choose is different from the font. And this is going to be one of the few times where I'm going to be pedantic about typeface and font. The typeface is the design of the characters, and the font is how they are delivered. Best analogy I've heard, and I tend to use because it made sense to me, so I think it's going to make sense to everyone else, is that if you think of a typeface as a song, think of the font as how that song is delivered. And the song can be delivered through an MP3, FLAC file, CD-ROM, like a compact disc, vinyl record, for those of us who are older, cassettes, and for those of us who are even much older, 8-track tapes. That's what the best analogy is. The typeface is the song, and the font is how that song is delivered, or that font file, or what that font file is. So when you go and you purchase a professional font file, or you download a font from Google Fonts or some other source, usually it has multiple font files. And typically what you're going to see is Roman, italic, bold, and in some cases, bold italic. But you're probably going to see at least 3 font files: Roman, bold, and italic. Some typefaces don't have a bold, and you need to compensate for that by using a different setting. But for the most part, you're going to see those three font files in most typefaces. The actual size you adjust through your software, but in the olden days, when they did actual metal typesetting, the font sizes were individual blocks of type, or letter blocks. So you'd have a 12-point G and a 12-point B, and all of a sudden somebody says that they want to go to a larger font size. You'd have to switch out those blocks of type. Now, I could go even further and explain what the point size means, but you know what? I'm going to save that for the fourth episode, fourth part in this series, only because that's delving too deep for our needs. We don't need to worry about that. So let's go back to talking about the difference between a typeface and a font. Just to give you some clarification in case I've completely confused you, Times New Roman would be a typeface. Times New Roman at 12 points is the font. Or Times New Roman italics is the font, right? The typeface is the family and encompasses everything. The font is a very specific version of that typeface. Okay. Now, because the font size is one of the 4 pillars, I'm going to try to use the term typeface for this part, so there's not a lot of confusion. And despite what most people say, the default typefaces that come with Word or the automated formatting software are rarely the best option available. There are some great open source typefaces available, but I'm going to recommend that you don't get them from Google Fonts. Those are almost all designed for use on web pages, and most will not translate well to print. Good example of this is Libre Baskerville. It's a typeface designed for screens. It was never intended to perform in print. Yet, I see it being used as a default typeface and recommended to others because it's listed as one of the default typefaces in one of the apps that's out there for formatting. Now, I'm going to go into a digression here, a little tangent, and you can probably skip forward. I'm going to guess maybe 45 seconds. That's my give or take about how long I'm going to ramble. The reason why it was included in this software is because authors wanted a Baskerville. Instead of doing the research or paying for a distribution license for a Baskerville designed specifically for print, they opted to use an open source typeface, which is fine. However, it's an open source typeface that has no business being used in print, which is the part that makes it not fine. They would have been better off telling their customers, you know what, there isn't a good Baskerville that's available, and why don't you use this typeface instead? There are much better open source typefaces available that can do the same thing as Baskerville that isn't Baskerville. Okay, so here's my exception. My digression is over, and I'm on to the next part. Sort of. I do have one exception for default text, Hoefler text. If you use Vellum, Hoefler should be available to you. And I'm going to say this right now. It is a phenomenal typeface that works well, really well in print. It's designed for print and design. It was designed to be exclusive to Apple. Apple commissioned it. Just like Amazon commissioned the creation of Booker Lee for its Kindle devices and Microsoft commissioned Georgia to be used in Word, Apple commissioned Hoefler Text for its design software, so it would be attractive to designers. That being said, Hoefler Text might not be the best typeface for your books. But it is actually probably one of the best default typefaces I've ever seen. Plus, just to give you an idea, if you were to go and buy the professional version, which you can do from, Hoefler must be from Jonathan Hoefler's the designers. It must be from Hoefler Foundry. I believe it's like $300 for 9 font files. It includes size fonts that aren't available with Apple and so aren't going to be available with Vellum, but it is a professionally designed typeface and it is a great option. And just to give you, I'm going to save this little bit for when I'm talking about other typefaces further on. Okay, next is going back to, I said trim size. You need to pick your trim size based on genre expectations. Well, you're also going to want to pick your typeface based on genre expectations. I'm going to get something out of the way. If you're writing nonfiction, just go with Caslon. If you have access to Adobe Fonts, go with Adobe Caslon. I'm trying to think of the other good Caslon typefaces. There are some really beautiful professional Caslons out there. I can't think of any free versions available, but like I said, Adobe Caslon, you're never going to go wrong with Caslon. Caslon, there's a saying in typesetting that says, when in doubt, go with Caslon. And it's a very neutral, it will fit anything and everything. You can never go wrong with Caslon. It might not be the best typeface choice, but it will never be a bad typeface for you to use. Okay, that out of the way, and that's especially for nonfiction. You can use it for fiction, that's perfectly fine, but there's a better when in doubt, go with typeface for fiction, especially genre fiction. Well, any fiction really. And that's Garamond. And the benefit of going with Garamond is Garamond has an open source typeface available called EB Garamond. And it is considered one of the best typefaces around. This is going to be an exception to where I said I probably wouldn't download a file from Google. In EB Garamond's case, I would. And that is because EB Garamond was incomplete. It didn't have, the original designer didn't have, I can't remember. I want to say didn't include a bold. I think it was bold that it didn't include. And so Google Fonts commissioned a designer to come in and complete the typeface, and it was done with the original designer's permission. In that case, if you want to use a Garamond and you don't want to pay a professional license, or you don't have access to a professional Garamond, then go with EB Garamond. When in doubt, go with EB Garamond. It will carry you through just about every work of fiction that you can come up with. And like I said, it's a great typeface, and it is available for free, and it's perfect for print. You cannot go wrong with it. That said, there are going to be better Garamonds. And a quick aside, not all Garamonds are named Garamond, and not all typefaces with the name Garamond is a Garamond. I know that's confusing. One case specifically, romance. There is a typeface called Saban, and Saban is a Garamond. It is used almost exclusively in romance. So there was a time frame when every romance book was set with Saban. And it is a great typeface. If you want to pay for it, by all means pay for it. If you write romance, by all means pay for it and use it. It will carry you from start to finish across every single book you do. And readers are primed to accept Saban as the typeface for romance books. My preference, if I'm going to use a Garamond, is to either use Adobe Garamond Pro or Garamond Premiere Pro. But as I said, most Garamonds are going to work, including EB Garamond, which is open source. Won't cost you anything to use. Now, if you're willing to invest in a typeface and pay for a commercial license, assuming you don't have access to Adobe fonts, then you might want to consider one of the mini Baskervilles. I would avoid, I believe it's ITC that has, most typesetters uniformly agree that ITC is the worst of the Baskervilles. One of the Garamonds, Saban if you write romance, Electra, or LFA Illumina, which is my personal preference, Caslon, or Minion. Minion and Electra are actually fairly similar, and if I had a choice, I'd lean towards Electra, but any of these fonts are going to work with just about any project you come up with. Like I said, Saban does a better job at romances, but any of the other typefaces that I listed will carry you throughout the entirety of your print publishing career. So really, quickly, just going through, Caslon, Garamond, Minion, Electra, or Baskerville are the tried and true typefaces, whereas EB Garamond is the only open source licensed typeface. And really quickly, just to give you an idea, LFA Illumina, I believe, is $75 for a commercial license, and it comes with 4 font files. It's my personal preference, so I use it all the time. It does not come with a bold, so you do have to make adjustments for that. That's okay. I use small caps instead. But it's a phenomenal typeface, and it's well worth the investment. Don't rule out a typeface because you'd much rather save money by going with a free typeface when you can invest in, and you only really need 2 font files for sure. Roman or book or text, whichever version they call it, and italics. If it comes with a bold, if you can get like a package family with a Roman italic, bold, and bold italic, grab it because it's probably a better deal. but it's worthwhile to invest in a professional designed with a commercial license that you can use across every single book that you publish, and you know you're never going to have a problem with it. And typically when you buy those typefaces and they update them, you're allowed, they will send you the updated files. So it's worth it to invest in a professionally designed typeface. But whatever you do, and whenever you end up deciding, please do a little bit of research. Read the write-up that accompanies most typefaces. It's the why and the how of the design and how the designer hopes the typeface will be used. Some designers will say right away, when I designed this typeface, it was intended to conserve space. So it's meant to be used at a smaller font size with larger leading, but it's going to take, they won't say take up less pages, but it will take up less space than some other typeface might. Or they're going to tell you that this typeface, was inspired by this designer or this old typeface. And it's really interesting to read those, but two, it will also give you an idea of if it's going to be a good typeface for a book. Some typefaces are great as headings or titles, but they fail miserably when it comes to body text. So if a typeface is tagged as either decorative or display, it probably shouldn't be used in the body of a book. Just because a font is tagged as book or text, it doesn't mean you can't use it as a heading or chapter display. It just means you're going to have to do a little bit of adjusting to make sure it works well. Because what happens is the actual strokes that make up the character are different sizes, are different widths, I guess you could say, and might be more narrow in a display setting, and they can get away with it because it's a larger size. That's really my only point, was if it's tagged as display or tagged as, it's tagged as display, don't use it as the body text. You can use it as a chapter heading, but don't use it as a body text. My personal ranking of typefaces, and again, this goes back to personal preference, is LFA Luminea, or Electra, Garamond, Caslon, and really only two Caslons, Baskerville. And Caslon and Baskerville can change places depending on which foundry they're coming from. And then Minion. If you're only interested in looking at free or open source typefaces, my suggestion or my recommendation is to look at Gandhi, Allegria, or E.B. Garamond. And my preference would be to tell you to go with E.B. Garamond. It doesn't mean that Allegria or Gandhi aren't great at print. They are. All three of these typefaces are designed specifically for print, and they look nice in a printed book. It's just that most readers are going to recognize, they're going to recognize Adobe Garamond first, but E.B. Garamond is close enough that the brain will make that association. Another quick word of warning, just to let you know, Crimson Text from Google doesn't work with POD printers. So it's not that it doesn't work with POD printers, it's just that POD printers won't print certain letters, and I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. They just don't print them, they're blank. They show up on the PDF proof, but they won't show up on the printed page. So just don't use Crimson Text from Google Fonts. You can use Crimson Pro or Crimson Text Pro, I forget the name, from GitHub. I have not worked with it, so I couldn't tell you one way or another, but don't use the one that's available on Google Font. And I'm going to give you a reference. Every so often, I'm going to release bonus episodes where I go more in depth with typefaces, and I'm not sure scheduling if the first bonus episode has gone out or not. I haven't decided. It's been recorded and edited. I just haven't decided if I'm going to put it before this one or after this one. I think they're going to go out. I'm going to put it out the next day. So it should be available. Depending on when you downloaded this and you listened to it, there might be a bonus episode available or not. But I go into much more detail about typefaces and how they handle certain genres, and go into more detail with the designer and the history of the typeface in general. But for now, you should just know that these 5 plus the 3 free typefaces are enough to handle just about every project out there. Going back really quickly, just so you know, and I'm gonna add them to the show notes so that in case you haven't written them down, you can quickly check. The 5 fonts that you can safely rely upon that are professional are going to be Electra, or if you're brave and, well, I don't even want to say brave, if you want to embrace the wonder and beauty that is LFA Illumina, which is basically Electra, Garamond, Baskerville, Caslon, and Minion. Any of those 5, sort of more, but is going to carry you throughout your entire publishing career. If you want to go with an open source, my first recommendation is to use EB Garamond, but don't rule out Allegria or Gandhi as additional choices because they really do work well in print. And I believe, just to give you an idea, I think Gandhi was, no, in fact, I know Gandhi was commissioned by a Mexican bookstore. So it's designed specifically for print books and to be used. I'm not 100% sure if it was specifically designed for POD printing. I don't believe it was. I believe it was designed for this bookstore chain to create imprints, but I do know that it works well in POD printing. And then just one final tip. The key to choosing the best font or the best typeface is to print up the pages so you can see what the typefaces look like on the page. And this to go back to when I said in the previous episode when I was talking about margins and that I'll throw in a public domain book. A lot of times I'll do that to print up sample pages so I'm not looking at my own words and distracted by that. I'm looking at the words of a book that in my case, I'm using The Great Gatsby. We've all read, I shouldn't say, most of us have read that book, and we know that first chapter well enough that we're not distracted by the words. So we're more able to look at the entire page and how the typeface is working with the margins and the trim size that you set up. So don't be scared to print up those pages, and don't be scared if you don't like something, get rid of it. If you don't like the way a typeface looks, don't use it. If you like the way another one looks, use that. I would say be careful that you aren't making your decision based on what you're seeing on screen, because what you see on screen is very different than what you see on the printed page. So definitely check that printed page. And if you're not sure, just go with EB Garamond. Like I said, you can't go wrong with it, or Adobe Garamond. One of those 2 Garamonds will cover all your fiction needs. And if you're writing nonfiction, just go with Caslon. Or, look at some of the others. If you're writing something that's more literary, then Baskerville is going to be a better option for you. I've also seen, and not the cozy mysteries, but like the Sherlock mysteries, although I don't know if Sherlock actually, no, because the murder can happen on page. And not the hard-boiled detective mysteries, but the traditional mysteries, definitely Baskerville works really well with those. But as I said, you're not going to go wrong with Garamond, and you're also not going to go wrong with Minion. Minion is a great option, and Electra is going to carry you through too. Of those 5, I don't think you can make a bad choice. And of the 3 open source typefaces, again, my preference, if I was to give somebody a recommendation, I would say go with E.B. Garamond. But don't give Gandhi and Alegria a try too. I think you'll be happy with the results. All right, so that's it for today's episode. In the fourth part and final part of the series, we're going to talk about font size and leading. And that is a lot more mathematical, a lot like the margins are. And we go through steps, and it's probably dry and boring, but it's worthwhile because I'm going to share a little secret with you. Of the four elements, the four pillars, using a font size or leading that is not the best choice can lead to a hot mess of a page. And even if you have the perfect trim size, the ideal margins, and a great typeface set, if you don't have your font size and leading set, you're going to have a hot mess on the page. So be sure to come back for next week's episode so you can learn how to best determine what font size and leading to use for your page. Thanks again to everyone for listening. Be sure to follow and subscribe to Dive into Book Design on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or however you listen. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review. To connect with me, Jules, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. Just look for Jules Corsair. If you want to message the podcast directly, please send an email to podcasts@diveintobookdesign.com.